So I think everyone has come in from the lobby, and Kelsie should be good to go.
Right, great. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to this meeting of the Winchester Carbon Neutrality Open Forum. I'm Councillor Kelsie Learney, the Cabinet Member for Climate Emergency at Winchester City Council. The Open Forums are regular events held to discuss topics relevant to the climate emergency, and the usual housekeeping rules for a public meeting apply, so we'd appreciate it if you turn your cameras off unless you're asked to turn them on. And today we will be discussing decarbonising transport and asking the question, can we step away from the car? Transport emissions are the largest source of greenhouse gases in the Winchester district, and without significant changes to the way we travel, we will fail to hit the government target to hit net zero by 2050, let alone the district's more challenging 2030 target. So to go through that with us this evening, we've got an exciting panel of speakers this evening, including from Sustrans, Stagecoach, Hampshire County Council and Winchester Action on the climate crisis. And after they've had the opportunity to speak, we will be having a question and answer session. A number of questions have been submitted in advance, which we will take first, but please feel free to enter questions in the chat as we go along, and we will take as many as we have time for at the end. This is a packed session, so at this point I will hand over to Roddy Crockett from Sustrans, who's the Partnerships and Public Affairs Manager, who's going to speak to us on active travel and thriving without owning a car. So over to you, Roddy.
Thank you, Kelsie. My name is Roddy Crockett, and I'm Partnerships Public Affairs Manager for England South. I'll just start sharing my slides, see if they'll come through. I'm hoping that people can see them now.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Roddy.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. So my name's Roddy Crockett, and I work for Sustrans, and we're a national charity, or we work actually in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales and England on active travel, and our main aim is to make it easier to walk and cycle. We do lots and lots of projects in lots and lots of different areas, and we've been around for about 50 years now. We have two main priorities, and one of which is called Paths for Everyone, which is about the National Cycle Network, and the other one is called Livable Cities and Towns. And by that we mean, how can we look at place in a different way in terms of making it easier for people to walk and cycle? So in trying to work out what to say today, I was trying to find out as much as I could about Winchester. So my presentation is probably going to be quite a few challenges and questions to ask. And I also feel that I'm a bit of a fraud in that actually this is probably the first part, it feels, of two presentations. Because at my first way of looking at it was to look at the top level needs in terms of carbon emissions. So I'll just move to my next slide. So as Kelsie has said, transport is a major issue in terms of emissions. And I'm just interested in the makeup between motorways, A roads and transport here. And in terms of making a transition to a low carbon sustainable transport network, one of the key things that we would like to make sure is front and center is a just transition. Now, in order to try and do that, you have to work regionally, county-wise, locally, and hyper-local as well, in terms of who's going to be winners, who might be losers. I sit on the steering group for the regional active travel strategy for transport for the southeast, and I'm also part of the Just Transition working group. So I've got quite a few ideas on what's important, but I'm very interested in hearing what people have to say today later on. I've looked at this in terms of where the carbon emissions are from. Apologies for many people are very familiar with this, but this is from Carbon Place, and this is showing the areas around Winchester that have the lifestyles of people which have the greatest emissions. I find it a very fascinating place to start. And also then when you go into that with this website, you drill down into flights and different aspects of people's lives in terms of where the carbon emissions are. And I also just drilled down into two areas here of Winchester just to look at the difference, Badger's Farm and St. Luke's, and looked at the differences in terms of flights for one thing in Badger's Farm and compared with the local authority average. And then looking at cars in St. Luke's. I don't know the areas, but very intrigued to know, what's going on in terms of these different areas. And also something else that we must remember is a lot of the people who might be living in a cosmopolitan student area end up later living in comfortable suburbia. So that's something which I find really useful to look at, is to try and see what's going on in terms of different people's lifestyles, because if we're going to have a just transition, we can't force people to change their lifestyles dramatically. We've got to use as many carrots rather than sticks. So understanding what people need and their lives is important to do a co-discovery or a co-design approach when we're thinking about changes. So the next thing I looked at was data shine. And data shine is based on the 2011 census, and that image in the middle is the journeys to a point in Winchester and their car journeys, and the blue are journeys to that location in the morning, and the red are journeys from that. So straight off, we've got Winchester is a place with lots and lots of commuting going on. And in terms of a just transition, how do we enable people to live without needing to own a car in some of those places and still be able to get to work? So just one of the things I saw when I was walking around is this park, walk and save idea that you've got. And I think that's a brilliant idea. And I think that if you wanted to expand your park and drive more, I think that would be a good idea. So what about the longer journeys versus the shorter journeys? And this is important in terms of, owning a car and how you're going to get around. So the majority of the emissions come from those longer distance journeys. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, that someone going to work 5 days a week is making 2 commuter journeys. And that really adds up in terms of compared with smaller journeys, which you might be making locally. But one of the things that can happen if you're needing to use lots of local journeys is that if you own a car, then you start using the car to then do the longer journeys as well. And it becomes quite easy once you have 1, 2 or 3 cars in a household to start using the car more regularly than perhaps you might like to because of the convenience. In trying to look at the work, and there's been some fantastic work in Winchester. Wow, you're really far ahead compared with other areas, which is great to see. But something that I find frustrating in terms of local transport plans and when carbon assessments are made is this idea of somebody else's emissions. It's scope 1, 2, and 3, but these scope 3 emissions that they're not including motorways, and transport for the north, they don't include national rail, they don't include motorways in that. Yet I saw that 39% of the transport emissions in Winchester come from the motorway. So I think you've got a real struggle here in terms of how do you enable people to get to Winchester in terms of having a thriving city centre for people who live further away, in terms of how they're going to get there if they're not going to use a car. So I'll come to that later in terms of many options that you can make. This is coming out more and more in terms of whose emissions, and I just put that bit from National Highways, which is from The Guardian, in terms of looking at the A303. And when they were doing the analysis of carbon emissions, they were just looking at the section that they were hoping to improve, not all the increased emissions that would occur along the whole length of the route. And one of the frustrations that I have is that the government still hasn't produced its quantifiable carbon reduction methodology from the Department for Transport. Now, we're not able to reduce carbon in a really significant way, in my view, unless we can work out whose budget is the carbon coming from, which areas is it coming from. And my personal view, this is Sustrans' view, is that the only way to do that is regionally, is that we've got too many borders which cross between urban and rural. And in terms of determining how we're going to reduce carbon emissions, especially through transport, is that we're going to have to look at a regional model, especially when road pricing comes in. Once the shortfall of tax from electric vehicles and fuel has really been realised, you know, something like 72 billion shortfall is predicted to occur because of the loss of fuel tax. So yeah, so I was saying about scope 3, you know, Transport for the North, in their analysis, they leave a lot of it out. Local plans usually leave quite a considerable reference to scope 3 and transport emissions. Schools, in terms of their analysis, they usually leave out scope 3 and tend to focus more on solar panels and what they can do on the school estate. But something interesting which is occurring from this year is that suppliers will be under pressure to report scope 3 for their deliveries. And more lower carbon freight options and last mile distribution hubs, I'm sure, are going to be coming in. And I think that's something that Winchester should be looking at. In terms, again, of living without owning a car, these micro consolidation and last mile Amazon lockers or walking deliveries, I think, are going to become more and more important. Part of a local transport plan says to meet national priorities to decarbonise the transport system. But I also think there are local priorities and city priorities which are also important to include in the local transport plan. At the moment, it feels like most organisations are thinking it's somebody else's problem to deal with. And I think that's a real issue that we've got to grasp. And part of the solution to that is really getting to grips with the data and trying to understand in terms of trip generators, who might be responsible for the carbon emissions that come from a trip generator, which might be in the middle of Winchester. So I've looked at the Winchester movement strategy. Brilliant piece of work, that really interesting. Again, we've got this figure that so much of the transport emissions come from motorways, and Transport for the South East, which I'll be coming to later, has got plans for developing motorways. Yet in the local transport plan, it's saying that we should be moving away from roads and focusing less on highway developments. And I also see that there's a large amount of transport reduction in emissions coming from electric vehicles, which I'm really interested to unpick, really, because what date is that's supposed to be coming from? Because you know, we're expecting about half of new sales to be EVs by 2030, and even then, with the electric vehicles, they tend to be larger. They don't really fit very well around Winchester city centre. I was in Winchester city centre in November, and the size of some of the cars, you know, we're really running out of space. And do we want to just swap all our cars for slightly larger ones, which are electric vehicles? We still got the problem that for 95% of the time, most cars are just sitting around, being stored in the public realm for a lot of the time. And is there a way that we can do car sharing? Can we make arrangements in villages where we sort of borrow each other's cars? And although that might sound quite cloud cuckoo land, I lived in the north of England for a year, and it was amazing how easy you could pick up a car to borrow from people in the village if you asked around. And for many people, that's how they use a car. So you see maybe lower rates of car ownership in villages, but actually there's still quite a high number of people using cars and borrowing cars and combining journeys to supermarkets. So the local transport plan, I think this is really quite advanced, really, compared with many others. You know, reducing car dependency, which is great. We've got car dependency on there because for many people in many villages and housing, they have got the car dependency locked in. And it may not just be one car in that household that they're locked into, it could be 2 or 3. So in terms of enabling people to have more money in their pockets, if you can reduce the number of cars that people need to own in order to thrive, then that makes it easier and makes people have more flexible lives too. And then Transport for the South East, I've been doing work with. This is their plans for Winchester and the Solent area, and I am really impressed with Transport for the South East's focus on data. And they're really getting to grips with what the size of the challenge, but they haven't got the answers yet, because national government really is not setting the scene in terms of how are we going to do road pricing, for example, or how are we going to work out whose emissions belong to which areas. And I was pleased to see in the local transport plan that that they accept that the past monitoring of schemes that have created extra road capacity also tends to show that that road capacity fills up with extra car journeys. And that's an important point to make in a local transport plan. So in Transport for the South East analysis, these are some of the things that they've reviewed in terms of what would make a difference. This is available online, and in order to try and achieve the rate of carbon emissions that the national government has set, we kind of need to do all these things, apply them all at once, because not all of them will be successful. If we don't really try and push for all of them at the same time, we're not going to get the reduction that we need. And so this is the only realistic way. In the local transport plan, it says the analysis shows that a 10% reduction in total vehicle is required between 2019 and 2030 in order to reach the target by 2030. My view is that needs to go further, and we need to be looking at 20%. If we don't hit the 10%, what are we going to get? 5%. And our position, Sustrans' position, shows that we need to reduce a lot more than we are at the moment. And there's also many co-benefits of reducing the number of cars that we need to own and to use. The government's figures show that even if 100% of new sales were electric vehicles by 2030, our mileage would still need to be reduced by 20%. So, and now that the government has gone back on the 2030 target, it's another example that if we don't apply all the levers that we've got, then we're not going to hit our target. So some of the co-benefits, well, there are many, and I urge you to go to the Sustrans website to look at some of the co-benefits in terms of air quality, in terms of health, in terms of public realm. But this picture's from Winchester and shows the amount of space that is available if we start rethinking our road system. 80% of public space in cities and towns is the road network. And linked to that is this idea that cars are getting wider and wider, bigger and bigger, heavier and heavier. And at a certain point, we haven't yet, we're going to have to say stop. We need to reduce the number of cars. We need to help households reduce the number of cars that they need to own or have access to thrive as well. More levers that we can apply, more working from home, reducing and focusing on the higher carbon journeys and switching to lower carbon stages. And by that, I mean the longer journeys, if we can help them be made by maybe an active travel leg, walking to the station or cycling to a bus stop, and then a public transport leg, and then maybe another active travel leg or another public transport leg. So it's those longer journeys, if we can switch some of them, not all of them, because there will be some places where it's just not possible really to thrive without access to a car. But of many of the places where we can reduce those higher carbon journeys, we should be looking towards working in those places. The lower carbon choices as well, EVs where required, active travel is the first choice as part of all journeys, looking at public and shared transport, community mobility. And my last point is about data. I think that the data that Winchester's put together is really, really great, and it really helps us try and come up with the vision and the strategies and policies that we all need to get behind. So Sustrans' approach is that we've got active travel officer already in Winchester City Council, Anna Heron, working there with workplaces. We've got network development, and linked to the network development is the development of local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. We've got a design and engineering department that focuses on local transport note 120, which is the brilliant guidance that came out from gear change. We work with major stakeholders. We try and integrate as much as possible with public transport, so active travel combined with public transport. And we also look at the public realm and making the case for better places. And by that, we're looking at new housing developments. Active Travel England now is a statutory consultee in developments which are over 150 units, I think it is, and they produced a great toolkit which asks every planning authority to apply for guidance and for Active Travel England to be a consultee and to get a report back on the developments they're proposing. So place-based approaches and working with the public realm is something that we're very keen to show that actually, if you make places attractive, to come to and spend time in. It's a bit like being on holiday all the time, because when you think about the places that you'd like to spend more time in, they're rarely with the idea of a traffic jam in the background. They're rarely a car park. They're rarely places where there are lots of cars. The places that we like to spend time are usually places that don't have cars. We might be using a car or another form of transport to get there, but actually when we're there, the kind of utopian places we like don't really feature cars. Now, what if we can actually create those utopian places in our own cities, in our own villages? And a lot of that does require the removal of cars. So finally, my last slide is travel is the hardest sector to reduce carbon emissions, in my opinion, and in carbon places. It's very difficult because it involves looking at people's lifestyles and making tweaks in terms of levers and carrots and sticks. So we need to reduce the need for transport, more working from home, more flexibility, think about domestic tourism. We need to live locally, think about circular economy and low carbon supply chains, and have carbon neutral local plans for when we're looking at housing. We need to think of low carbon transport choices, EVs, and active travel as the first choice as well, and also governance, policy, and data as well. And if we do this, then we can live a more cleaner, active, social, prosperous and healthy, and include learning in our life as well. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Roddy. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. I was particularly taken by the contrast between St Luke Ward, which for those of us on this call who know Winchester is actually Stanmore, which is council estate, which does have a lot of students living on it, with Oliver's Battery and Badger Farm, which is actually the ward right next door. So it does show how you have areas with very high travel next to those who actually do use active travel and public transport a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm sure
yeah, sorry, I've only been to Winchester twice, I should say. So I'm really interested. Now I've looked at it and done some analysis. I've just got so many questions. I'd love to have people, question of what about this, what about this? And actually, the only time I've been there, I cycled from London to Winchester via Hastings, Eastbourne, and the Isle of Wight when I was 15 years old. I only just remembered that yesterday. That a group of friends of mine, after our O levels, we cycled to Winchester, and then the only other time I've been there was last November when went on the train. So I can say that I've never been to Winchester in a car.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm quite conscious of time, so we will come back for questions later. But we will now hand over to Marc Reddy, Stagecoach South Managing Director, to talk about Stagecoach's sustainability strategy towards a zero emissions bus fleet.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me. That's the main thing. So thanks for inviting me along. I'm, as just said, I'm the Managing Director for Stagecoach South. I've only been in post 7 months, so you will have to forgive me on not knowing every bus route in my area. But let's see how we go through anyway. The other thing I would say is I'm not anti-car. I have a car myself, even though I run a bus company. And in my view, it's how you use your car is the most important thing to think about. So a little bit about Stagecoach. We're the largest bus operator in the UK with 23% market share. And every year we're transporting around 500 million passengers, or customers, as I prefer to call them, on our buses. And we make a big influence on the economy, and we're operating buses as far north as the Orkney Islands and as far south, or southwest I should say, as Cornwall. And we also operate buses in the big metropolitan areas like Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, London, as well as the provincial towns that we're used to seeing as well. More locally, Stagecoach is an operating company that I lead, Stagecoach South. We've got 8 depots operating buses across Hampshire, Surrey and West Sussex, and also into the unitary of Portsmouth. We're a collection of former nationalised bus companies that were privatised back in the 80s and early 90s, and we've brought together a number of those different companies to create Stagecoach South. And obviously in Winchester itself, we have a depot where we've got just over 45 buses and employ 130 people locally in the city. So I thought it was worthwhile just mentioning how buses work, because this is an interesting context. So it enables people just to think about how we can make it all work, but not only the customer, but how funding and how the bus company needs to make it work commercially as well. So the vast majority of bus services outside of London, there's a small exception in the northwest at the moment, and the Northern Islands excluded. Operators provide the services without any direct subsidy, and in essence, what's paid on the bus is there to cover the costs. When somebody uses a concessionary pass, that's a subsidy to that person, and then we get paid a flat rate for each concessionary pass that's used. Gaps in the market, sometimes called socially necessary, that's where local authorities can provide financial assistance to have them operate, and different local authorities take different views on that. And that's normally, not all the time, normally run by the Highway Authority. But please say in the case of a place like Winchester, they do tender their own bus services, Winchester City Council, and I know Eastleigh Borough Council do the same as well. And in particular for Winchester, that's the park and ride service that we operate. Vehicle investment for new buses or diesel buses have always come from the private sector without any liability to the taxpayer. But in the last 2 years, with the drive to decarbonisation, the government has launched schemes which are known as ZEBRA, and for the life of me, I can't remember what it stands for. Zero Emission Bus Regional Area Fund or something along those lines. It's easier to remember the word ZEBRA. And the government support paying 75% of the difference between a brand new diesel bus and a brand new alternative fuel bus. And I'll come on to that more in a minute. But one thing to note is COVID hit the industry very hard. Nearly 4 years ago, you'll remember Boris on a Monday night saying you must stay at home, and in essence made that message really strong to the effect that if you use public transport, you will get COVID. That has been very difficult to iron that myth out, although the industry does try, and we do try hard, but it is noticeable that concessionary pass holders have had a lower bounce back than commercial passengers. And in Winchester particularly, we see that our passenger numbers are between 70 and 76% of pre-COVID levels. So we've still got 25% of people no longer travelling. And a lot of that is where people are doing a lot of work from home, particularly with what we're doing now, remote sessions with Teams and Zoom and so on. So our decarbonisation journey in Stagecoach, it's worth saying we've got 364 electric vehicles already. You can read the numbers for yourself there in terms of what that equates to in a contribution to avoiding carbon. In essence, you're looking at around about 46 tonnes of reduction in carbon per year from every electric bus that goes on the road. And you also deliver the 23 kilograms of not having any NOx, nitride oxides, in the atmosphere as well. So it does make a contribution to air quality. There's no question about it. We're very committed at Stagecoach and have set an ambitious target of having a zero emission fleet by 2035. So start ticking the years off. That's only 11 years away, and we anticipate to be fully net zero across our business by 2050. And you'll see other various decarbonisation metrics there as well. But predominantly, and as said before earlier on in the presentation from Roddy, you know, transport does make up a fair share of carbon, but we're just talking about bus and public transport in this realm, and you'll find that cars obviously add their fair share to that carbon being into our atmosphere. So by 2035, we want a zero emission fleet, and just wanted to go through with you the options that we have. So we have the clean diesel, as it's called now, the Euro 6 bus. We've got a number of these in Winchester, get you about 300 miles a day. It's not zero emission, but it's a big change from the old diesel buses of 20 years ago. A relatively simple depot infrastructure. You need a fuel pump and a tank, but the fuel does need to be delivered to the depot, and that generates emissions in itself. And at the moment, it is still cheaper than alternative fuels. There's then biogas. Sorry, I should say a clean diesel vehicle is around about £280,000 each double decker. In contrast, you can have a gas bus, biogas, that's looking at about £380,000 per vehicle. You're looking at about £250,000 to have a gas plant in the depot. And not many manufacturers are doing this anymore. It's turned into a bit of the Betamax of the alternative fuels. And, you know, gas has been tried for many years. So in Southampton, they introduced gas buses in 1995 with varying degrees of success. More recently, in about the last 5 years, gas buses have been rolled out in places like Bristol and Reddy. But the majority of manufacturers, as I say, are now moving away from offering that that option, and biogas is not fully zero emission. So then you have the EV, the electric vehicle, about 240 miles a day. You've got to factor in that you'll need a replacement battery, just like you have to do with your iPhone, that those are on Apple now and then. It's the same principle. But there's other challenges around depot infrastructure, and I'll come on to that shortly in some of the things that we have to do. But the good thing about electric vehicles is it's easy to make add marginal additional vehicles, providing there's enough capacity in the grid. Whereas other, like the gas buses, you know, you need to put a gas plant in there. Probably for the maximum amount of buses you need. You can add elements to a gas plant, but it's not easy. And an electric double decker will cost you just under £500,000 each at the moment. So as I said before, a diesel's about 280, an EV is just under £500,000. So there's quite a difference there, and that's where the government's helping to support 75% of that difference. And then finally, you've got hydrogen vehicles around 280 miles a day. You're going further north in the price now. We're looking at about £600,000 a bus. £2.5 million to put in a hydrogen plant in the depot. There are a few operators around with them. So there's a hydrogen plant at the bus depot in Crawley. There's West Midlands and Aberdeen. They are very challenging vehicles to keep on the road. They're expensive. They're more expensive to maintain. And the other big issue at the moment is that the Health and Safety Executive are very reluctant to sign off these plants at the bus depots. I believe there's one person in the whole of the UK that does it, and it's proving very challenging. So I know one operator that's got it is actually just bringing in small bottles of hydrogen to then fill the buses, rather than having a major plant with a big tank there, because they can't get it signed off by the HSE. So I said it was a conundrum on my opening slide. These are some of the things that we need to think about when going for alternative fuels. What fuel? And we probably covered that already. Depot infrastructure. Obviously for EV, the big issue is there enough juice in the pipe that comes to the depot? It can be there today. When you talk to the DNO, the distribution network operator, the Southern Electrics of the world, somebody else might take it tomorrow. And so that's a real key element. And sometimes there might not be enough juice in there to supply the whole depot. And again, I'll come on to that in a minute. But do you charge the buses at night? Do you, when they're in the depot, is there opportunity charging out on the road? But by having charging in the depot, does mean that your footprint of the depot increases by about 15%. And as I've said there, is there enough power in the grid? And the other thing that we all need to be mindful of, it's a monopoly option here going to the distribution network operator. And you can't get the power from anywhere else. So what we have done is we've employed consultants that used to work for DNO to make sure that we're getting value for money when we're giving quotes for grid connection. But there's still maintenance, just like diesel pumps, chargers, sockets, and you also have to take into account, particularly with EV, on the terrain and the range. And just like your EV car, you will get less mileage or range out of it in the winter time than you will in the summertime, by definition of, you know, the weather makes an effect on the battery, and also the various different heaters and functions on the vehicle that will be drawing current in the winter compared to the summer. So locally, I've got 9 electric buses. I have them in Guildford, had them there since 2019, and we don't have enough energy in the grid to charge all the buses. So we have an innovative solution where during the day, batteries from Tesla, the car manufacturer, are charged. And then when all the buses are in at night, they're connected to the grid, and they're also connected to the batteries as well to ensure that there's enough charge for the following day. You know, it really is critical in making sure that there is enough juice in the grid. Otherwise, you do have these challenges, like I've said here, and obviously the Tesla batteries will need replacement at some time in the future as well. I'll just show you a short video about our electric vehicles in Guildford, only a couple of minutes, if I may. Oops. Okay, so that gives you a little flavour of what we do in Guildford with our electric buses. And then finally, we can all talk about decarbonisation, and I'm a big advocate of it, and it makes a huge, collectively, it makes a big benefit to air quality. But the big worry I have is that we'll all move to electric vehicles, electric cars, we'll have electric buses, but those people that move to electric cars will think to themselves, I've done my bit for the environment, I've done my bit for air quality. But unfortunately, it just means that we're all sat in the same congestion, except we're not giving tailpipe emissions. And to make the bus attractive, it has to be quicker. And that's been proven up and down the country. You make a bus quicker, it makes it more attractive, and people will use it. So I'll leave that thought with you, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was very informative and very helpful. I'm a regular bus user myself, and big app fan, so which helps us know when the bus is actually turning up or not. But I think there are a few questions around the buses which we'll take up later, but I am keen to move on, so we'll hand over to Stewart Wilson, who's the Principal Transport Planner at Hampshire County Council, who will be talking to us about Local Transport Plan 4 and the County Council's role in reducing reliance on private car travel. So over to you, Stewart.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm Stewart Wilson, Principal Transport Planner at the County Council. I'm I actually work in the scheme development team. So we essentially work on developing schemes that have been identified in strategies, trying to take those forward and identify funding to deliver those. And yeah, I'm going to talk about the draft local transport plan 4, and as by way of background, so it's a statutory requirement for all local transport authorities to develop and publish local transport plans, and that's set out in the enabling legislation, the Transport Act 2000. What does a transport plan do? It describes council's essentially the policy framework for transport in an area, and it's an important document because it helps to it's helpful in terms of securing funding from central government, but it also signals to other agencies and stakeholders the county council's priorities for transport. And the current local transport plan 3, which was developed in 2011, is no longer fit for purpose or relevant to today's challenges, and hence why the county council is developing a new local transport plan. LTP4 has already been developed and consulted on in several stages. So there was a scoping and stakeholder engagement work in 2021 and 2022. Over the same period, there was an evidence base that was developed, including some carbon emission forecasting, and a consultation in between April and June 2022. So the county council, I think, was expecting to adopt LTP4 not long after the public consultation, but it was waiting for DfT to update its LTP guidance, and we're still waiting for that, and it doesn't look like that will be coming soon. So the county council is going to go ahead anyway and put forward LTP4 adoption in 2024. So hopefully that will happen in the first half of this year. But just to be clear, the presentation covers the draft LTP4 and not the LTP4 that will be adopted. So there were 3 big issues for LTP4: climate change, and obviously there is urgent action required in order to avoid dangerous climate change caused by greenhouse gases, including transport-related CO2, and a recognition in LTP4 that if we carry on with existing policies and practices, we won't meet our carbon neutral target for 2050. And I think somebody else has already said that based on the evidence base that was developed for LTP4, we need to reduce car mileage by around 10% to achieve that. So it isn't just about zero emission vehicles. We do need to reduce traffic. The other big theme was health and society. So transport clearly plays a vital role in our lives, in how we access work or facilities and services, and not being able to access those things does mean that people live in isolation, can affect their ability to work. We also have quite high levels of car use across the county, and a lack of walking and cycling and other active travel, and that does contribute to obesity and poor health. When LTP4 was being developed, that was when the pandemic was on, or just after, and but I think this is still obviously relevant today. We do need to think about how we a shift in how we support economic growth in the context of climate change, and obviously transport has a key role to play in that. But I think taking all those big issues, LTP4 recognises that at the heart is a need to reduce car dependency, and particularly private car use. And And that means reducing traffic levels, as I said. The evidence suggests we need to reduce traffic by around car mileage, by around 10% if we're going to achieve carbon neutrality. But it also means providing people with more choice, and the other speakers have already spoken about needing better walking and cycling routes and infrastructure. We need quicker buses, and we need an increased bus network as well. And obviously there are challenges with trying to achieve those things. So this slide is LTP on a page. I mean, as you can appreciate, a local transport plan is quite a large document. Essentially, there are 4 outcomes around these key themes of climate change, environment, economy, and society. And then there are 2 guiding principles, reducing the overall need to travel and significantly reducing dependency on private car, and alongside that, providing a transport system that enables high quality and prosperous places. We also have a number of core policies that cut across climate change, road safety and freight. And then there are a number of specific policies based around these kind of themes, such as public transport development and master planning, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next couple of slides. And then there's a whole section on implementation and how we're going to prioritise schemes. So yeah, I just thought it would be important to kind of go into some of the themes in a bit more detail. And one of the themes is called planning for people and places. That might seem like an obvious thing to do, but that's not really what we've been doing as transport planners and engineers over the last few decades. So essentially what we're trying to do is to shift away from planning for vehicles, move away from worrying about affecting car capacity and delaying cars, to thinking about places and spaces and planning for people. So there are some quite key things in LTP4 to try and achieve that. One of them is a transport user hierarchy. So thinking about prioritising the most vulnerable and most sustainable transport modes and having those at the top, and the least vulnerable and least sustainable at the bottom. There's also something called a movement and place framework, and to try to get us to think differently about our roads and our streets. So not just through routes, but places where people spend time, socialise, and enable activities that add vitality to neighbourhoods, for example, and something that is being rolled out across the council, including training for transport planners and engineers and others, is the healthy streets approach. So again, it's thinking about roads as streets and how we can make them more attractive, more comfortable and safer for walking and cycling. And I think that's a big step change and for the county council and really how it approaches developing and designing and implementing improvements across the transport network and system. I think it's a really important thing, and this has been touched on by others, but I mean there's sort of lots of reasons for doing that, practical as well. And I mean essentially our streets do not have the space to accommodate an ever increasing amount of car traffic, and even if they did, it's not really something that we want to do, because we know that creates poor and unhealthy places to live. So in many areas, attractive walking, cycling and public transport options mean that we can carry many more people around more efficiently. The next slide was on development and master planning, and so this is really about the County Council working with planning authorities, including Winchester City Council, in trying to influence the location and design of developments in order to reduce the need to travel and reduce car dependency. And there are a number of factors that are listed in this slide for what is needed for high quality developments. And the County Council itself is looking to produce development planning guidance and updating its guidance on transport assessments and travel plans in order to help achieve more sustainable housing and employment sites. Next slide, making it happen. So LTP has a kind of route map to 2050, and in the short term, that's really about developing area strategies and plans, and I'll talk a little bit more about bus service improvement plans and local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. It's about a big cultural shift internally, so how the organisation develops and implements the transport system. And I said earlier, it's really thinking about roads as streets and places now. The County Council leading by example, so trying to reduce its own carbon emissions, and embedding movement and place framework, which I talked about earlier. And then in the medium term, so 5 to 10 years, it's about trying to deliver those measures that are required to support a mass shift in mode use, and achieve the transition from traffic growth to traffic reduction, and then over the longer term trying to consolidate those travel behaviours. I thought it would be helpful just to very briefly talk about some of those some of the challenges. Obviously funding is a big challenge for us because most of the funding that we get for walking and cycling improvements, to implement bus priority and other bus measures, comes from central government. That involves generally a kind of competitive bidding process. We really aren't very good at providing enough funding, and that being long-term investment for these kind of things. So that is a challenge, and I think particularly around things like placemaking and an urban realm, which is much more expensive. We typically don't have enough funding for those kind of improvements. The other challenge is around behaviour change. So I've said about the kind of internal cultural shift required at the County Council. I think it's also about people changing their behaviour and doing that in a way that providing those alternatives, but also nudging people to make those changes. I think there's a sort of fine balance there. Next slide. I just wanted to briefly talk about providing better walking and cycling, which is obviously essential in reducing car use and dependency. And we aim to do this through a step change in walking and cycling infrastructure. So the County Council has been developing local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, and these are evidence-based plans that identify preferred walking and cycling routes and a programme of infrastructure improvements, as I say, to improve and increase cycling. The intention is for LC whips to become fully adopted policy documents, so hopefully they'll carry more weight in local transport plan and local planning policies. For Winchester City, there was an LC whip which was developed as part of the Winchester movement strategy, and that's being updated and reviewed, and it will cover the whole district. I'm hoping to consult on that later in the year. And in terms of buses, we also aim to speed up public transport, including more bus lanes and bus lane enforcement, and obviously work with operators under a new enhanced partnership to make services better. And I've listed here some of the things that are going on and being done. So in the Winchester City Council area, there are some things called bus route improvement plans, and those are being developed for several routes in the city, the route 2, 3 and 5, and also for some routes outside of the city, but in the district, the 64, the 66 and the Star 7. The council is also using some of the funding that we've secured from central government for the bus service improvement plan to bring about some service enhancements within the district, and we're still working through the detail of those, and we're hoping to be able to share some more information in spring. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Stewart. I think we've had a lot of questions about where the county council is on all of this work, and it's really useful to have that update. As you say, the LTP4 is a fundamental change from managing growth to encouraging decline in terms of motorised transport, and it is something that people are struggling to get their heads around to a degree. I think one of the things that changed my thinking about a lot of this was going to a local school to talk to them about what new play equipment they'd like. They told me they didn't want new play equipment. They wanted the local streets to be safe enough for them to be allowed to go to the playground in the first place. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need to apply to a lot of this. So we'll move on to our final speaker. So thank you, Stewart, which is the Winchester Action on the Climate Crisis, Chair of the Transport Working Group, Phil Gagg. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Kelsie. I need to find the presentation. Is that, can people see that?
Yep. Yes, that can be seen. Thanks, Phil.
Fantastic. Well, I think my job is to do a brief presentation and to cover the parts that other people may not have reached. So what I thought was I'd say a word or two about, I think I'm going too fast. A word or two about the urgency and scale of the problem, because people have talked about particular issues, sometimes a bit technical, about particular modes. I want to talk about the overall picture very briefly. And this is a visual way of showing the overall picture, and shows very clearly in the purple line at the top how transport has dominated, and this was covered quite a lot in the Sustrans presentation, by transport, much more than domestic, much more than agriculture, much more than commercial. So it's really important, I think, to get transport right. And you'll see there was a big dip during COVID, but it's going up, which is rather alarming. So the real achievement will be to make sure it doesn't go up as far as it used to be. And this is another way of looking at it in 2021. And you can see that transport by far outweighs the size of emissions associated with domestic or agriculture. And certainly industry and commercial are really, and certainly public sector, are really insignificant. So very important to get transport right. And it's not a normal situation, this. Winchester is outstanding in terms of the emphasis on emissions that transport causes. And this is one way of putting that, which is to look at how many emissions, what emissions there are per head. And you can see that Winchester on this scale is usually about twice as much per head as the national average. It's urgent. this is a way of looking at all emissions in Winchester. And if we are to achieve net zero by 2030 or have a go, we've got to do something really radical for the rest of this decade. And you can see that the drop in emissions is severe. But it's not just the emissions that matter. Let's go to the other end. Certainly, it was a very interesting presentation about buses, but what we have to do is not only worry about the grid and make sure people get enough electricity for electrified road transport and other things at the same time as we're trying to electrify our housing heating, but also we need to produce green electricity. It's no good electrifying transport and then fueling it by electricity that's produced by gas. You only save 1/3 of the emissions. So back to back with the need to electrify is the need to produce green electricity to meet the demand. And you can see here that electricity from renewables is very, very little of all our energy use. This big black grey segment here is all the petroleum that we use, the diesel and electricity, but also there's additional petroleum and gas. So we're only just beginning to produce green electricity. We've covered, we haven't covered walking much, but we've covered cycling and public transport. But I think what I'd really like to say is it's more important that people change their mode, get out of their cars, use the buses, start to walk, start to cycle, than it is that we electrify the buses. And I think maybe Stagecoach are underselling their role by not emphasizing that we need to have more people on every bus, because a single car in Winchester not only uses an awful lot of causes an awful lot of emissions, but only on average carries about 1.25 people. And when you think of it, you get a car and a half in the length of a bus, and we're only transporting about 2 people by car on average. Then we could transport probably, if we were to be ambitious, 20 people in each bus. So for about the same gain in terms of emissions. So persuading people to use more buses, designing walking, cycling and public transport infrastructure very well. And I think our colleague from Hampshire County Council was covering this. If we can get people to transfer the mode, that's even more important than developing the technology. Cars, vans and lorries, the public discourse is usually, oh, well, it'll be all right because there's battery electrification. Well, we've got to get the green electricity from somewhere to fuel that. And they will use enormous amounts of green electricity. This is the graph of the growth in plug-in electric vehicles in Winchester district. And you can see it's really, really optimistic. It's an exponential curve. More and more people are buying electric vehicles as the years proceed. But we have to just look at the sheer number of electric vehicles that were recorded early in 2023 in the Driving Vehicle Licensing Authority, and it was 1,800. And if we then compare that with other vehicles, we end up with 1,800 as a proportion of 90,000. And the really worrying thing about this chart is that despite everyone's wishes, despite everyone's aspirations, the number of petrol and diesel vehicles on Winchester district roads that are licensed within Winchester is still growing. So year on year, we get more and more diesel and petrol vehicles. So the outlook is really, really quite worrying. And what we will have to do is something quite radical if we're going, and I think I agree with earlier speakers that there is a fundamental need for lifestyle change. But of course, we've got to find ways of doing that so that people don't feel bullied or intruded upon. And I think that is the real challenge that we've got in the next few years. I'd just like to say it was great to hear from Sustrans, but it would be great, Kelsie, if there were time for someone from Cycle Winchester to say just a few words about how what Sustrans was talking about might apply to Winchester District. And I hope that when we return to working on the Winchester Movement Strategy, we can make sufficient amendment from the earlier iterations to take account of Hampshire County Council's most welcome desire to reduce the number of cars. But I do doubt whether a reduction of 10% will be enough to come up with the arithmetic that means that we have to find ways of fueling our transport system and not blow the electricity supply. So they're just a few thoughts for people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. We really appreciate all the work that WinACC do on developing this data and helping us graphically understand what's going on in particular over time. We are going to move now into the question session. We've got about a quarter of an hour for questions, so I will prioritise the questions that were sent in advance. So if our presenters could turn their cameras back on and reappear on the screen to take them as appropriate. The first question is from Henrietta Boucher, of a Crawley Parish Councillor, who asks, there are many people within the Winchester district who live in rural villages and not the Winchester city centre. Many of the policies that the Winchester groups tend to discuss appear to be very anti-car to those who live outside of the city. There are very few villages who have a dependable bus service that would allow for reliable commuting or even getting in and out of town at convenient times, particularly in the evening. It is also expensive and a great deal slower than cars. Does this forum recognise this challenge, and how will it introduce new policies without alienating the rural car user? The question's a lot longer than that, but I have paraphrased. I know everybody's seen the full question. There was a later linked question which on similar lines, which was, in satellite villages, walking to the city isn't an option and bus services are limited. What can be done to help these communities reduce their travel footprint? Roddy, do you want to go first? I know you referred to this in your presentation.
Yeah. It's a really good question, and it's all part of how to try and achieve a just transition. And it's also linked to governance and where the boundaries are between different parish and town and city and district councils and county councils are as well. but regarding walking, every journey has walking involved or cycling involved in it. You know, it's part of every single journey. Every journey, even if you're walking to the car or wheeling to the car if you've got a wheelchair, involves active travel. And the more that we rely on vehicles to take us from one place to another in comfort and warmth, the less likely we're going to get our physical activity in order to just keep our health. So I think that enabling physical activity in rural areas is really important, and looking at the public rights of way and how to connect villages up so that people have got nodes where they can access either shops or transport services. I've been part of a rural mobility group and Transport for the South East looking at this specific issue, and it is tricky, but there's quite a lot of levers you can apply. I talked about demand responsive transport, and I know that just near near sort of near Crawley and Basingstoke, Billingshurst. There used to be Jake's taxis that used to run a service once they'd done all the runs into school. They used to do connecting people up, and there's also some of the buses that connected up with the supermarkets as well. So I think there's a range of levers that can be applied in rural areas, but to have a policy that penalises people who live in villages to get into city centres is unfair and unjust, I think. But I think that to think that there aren't alternatives, I think is wrong. I think that there's lots and lots of things that you can do to enable active travel routes between villages and towns, and using e-bikes, e-scooters if they become legalised. Or autonomous vehicles. I know somebody who lived in rural areas was unhappy that she'd never get one of those Milton Keynes robots delivering her Waitrose food, and wanted one of those. And so, yeah, why not? If we have sealed surfaces, then we can have autonomous vehicle deliveries in rural areas.
Yeah, and certainly at the City Council, we're very conscious of that rural-urban divide. I was brought up in the countryside, and I know how difficult transport can be, which is partly one of the reasons why I choose to live in the city now, where it is much easier, particularly when you have children. One of the things you mentioned in your presentation was, for example, the park and walk and park and ride that we have in Winchester, and certainly encouraging that modal shift partway through the journey to when people come into the city from the countryside is, I think, really important. But we do recognise that there are issues in the evening, which is why we keep a lot of car parks close within easy walking distance of the centre free. The other thing that we're looking at in terms of helping with those mobility issues is around expanding the number of disabled spaces within the city. So essentially taking space away from general car users who can walk, and making sure that throughout the city, for people with real mobility difficulties, there's access to those spaces. Stewart, did you want to add anything from the county point of view?
Well, I think it's only probably to repeat what you've said, that, you know, as part of the Winchester movement strategy, there is a plan to expand the park and ride capacity, and proposals to help improve, link those with more buses, and buses that are quicker and that aren't caught up in congestion. And in terms of the LC WIP, so the local cycling walking infrastructure plan, that's not just focused on the city, but looking at it district wide, so to try and help with those connections where people are able to cycle in from the immediate surrounding areas into the city. So there are already a number of policies and plans to help with that. As you say, they could be further improved.
Yeah, Marc, and buses clearly are an important part of this transition. How do we provide better services in the countryside?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, a quick example is we've added enhanced the frequency on service 64, which goes Winchester to Alton. And so there's more buses on a Sunday. We've extended the operating day. And last May, I think it was, we operated the Sunday service free of charge for eight weeks on a Sunday. That generated some great growth. And we've kept, obviously people are paying now at the reduced fare of £2, but we've kept that enhancement on the Sunday service. So, you know, we're quite happy to try things and see if we can stimulate demand. It won't work on everything. We've got to accept that. But we've also got to remember it's one of those things you need to use it rather than have a bus service there as an insurance policy for when you don't have another mode of transport. So it really is about putting money where your mouth is and using the bus. And while the government is doing a grand job, and regardless of colour of government, I think it's a great initiative to have a flat fare of no more than £2 on the buses at the moment. And that's likely to last till the end of this year. So there isn't a better time to try the bus.
Yeah, I have to say the 64 is also a great scenic bus route. If you want a day out and a nice cup of coffee in Alresford, then I can definitely recommend it. A related bus question from Peter Jacob, who lives in central Winchester. Every time the county council has to make spending cuts, subsidised bus routes always get hit hard. Areas like Oliver's Battery, Osselbury and Albrook, which used to get regular services, now get nothing or a token service a couple of days a week. If we're encouraging public transport use, why aren't efforts made to stimulate use before cuts are made, which presumably exacerbate further passenger avoidance and justify further cuts, a vicious circle? Yeah, I'm sorry to pass this on to Stewart, who clearly is here representing the county council. I think we all understand that the county's in a difficult position, but obviously the cuts to bus services are something that people are very worried about. Where are we on those cuts?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing, isn't it? And some difficult choices that are having to be made. In terms of where we are, I'm just trying to find. I believe there haven't been any decisions yet made in terms of what cuts and whether cuts will be made. So I think that those decisions still need to be made. I'm just trying to find the email, but I can't find it. So
the consultation is live, I think, Stewart, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yes, so the county are doing a wide-ranging consultation currently on cuts they're proposing, which cover not just bus services, but also road maintenance, street lighting, and a whole range of other things. So I would encourage people on this call to have a look at the county council website. It is being widely promoted. I mean, a related question is whether the City Council are putting pressure on Hampshire County Council to keep services that are vital to the rural community. We do put what pressure we can on the County Council to emphasise the importance of particular bus services. We do generally respond to consultations where that's appropriate, and clearly rural transport is something that really matters in a lot of our country areas. I would also say, though, that some of the subsidised services, as has been mentioned separately, aren't very frequent and aren't really a substitute for an effective regular bus service, which really encourages people to get out of their cars and change the mode of transport. But it is something that we're very conscious of. I don't know, Phil, did you have a comment on bus services?
Yes, I think we're looking at the hardest cases, and and indeed it's really important that people who live in isolated communities have good public transport, and that's a real burden on the council rates. But I think if we're also concerned to get more people to cause fewer emissions, the example that Marc gave of the improvement of the bus service to Alton is really important. What we need to do, I think, is concentrate on providing much better services where people will respond. And the example of the 64 gives us that, which means that at least we're getting people out of cars where the bus service exists. And I think there's a great deal of mileage, dare I say mileage, there's a great deal of benefit we can get from improving major bus services and leave more space on the roads for the people who have no option but live in isolated villages. So I think we need to be very sort of strategic in how we persuade people to use their cars less. And where it's possible to provide good public transport, for example, a good suburban service from Winchester to Southampton on the railway, then we should improve that. And that will reduce the actual volume of cars as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very well made point. Right, I'll bring Stewart back in again.
I was just going to add, and I think in my presentation, I did talk about where there is a focus on some of the routes within the city and some of those interurban routes, and I think that's the idea. It's where we think it's best to target funding, because that's where we think we're going to get the greatest impact. I think that is what is being done. I mean, I'm not directly involved in this. There are other colleagues at the county council that are in the public transport team, but I think that is basically what they're doing. So just to be clear.
Yeah, Peter makes the point that his question is really about the cumulative decisions which have been taken over time, which I think we all understand that has impacted the use of bus service in rural areas over not just the past few years, but decades. In another question from Peter, he asks, are there ever going to be more useful cycling routes around the district rather than half-hearted measures like painting cycle symbols on a busy road, or routes that are unsuitable, narrow pavements on Worthy Road, and the route that crosses over various roads from the top of Otterbourne Hill through the village towards Winchester? We are currently working on the LC WIP, but I think Stewart highlighted the issues around funding. Do you want to comment on some of the schemes that are within the LC WIP, Stewart, and that we've been working on city and county together?
Yeah, so I think I said that the updated LC WIP is being updated, and there'll be a consultation this year. But in the meantime, we have been quite successful in getting some funding. So we are developing proposals for Worthy Road, for the whole corridor, and phase one of that, so the section of Worthy Road between Dyson Drive and Stoke Road will be implemented this summer, and obviously if we've got a design, that puts us in a better position in the future to secure some funding. And there are other schemes going on in the city. So there's a crossing going on Romsey Road and some changes to traffic management. So that trial will be starting in March. And there are various other schemes in the city centre. But yeah, funding is a problem. I think space is a big issue as well. And it goes back to that need to reduce traffic levels. You know, if we are to get LTN 120, which is the guidance that was published by the DFT a couple of years ago, if we are to get LTN 120 compliant cycle infrastructure in places like Winchester City, where obviously the roads are very narrow, it does require us to think about reducing traffic as well. It's a challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Stewart. Moving on, we have a question from Nick Goulder in Alsford, which is around one way the City Council could reduce reliance on cars would be to persuade HCC to allow use of the household waste tips by pedestrians. Now, this is something which I don't think anybody on this call is actually able to answer, but it is a point that we recognise that we do need to look at access to services by foot and other forms of transport, not just expect people to rock up in a car. So that's one which I will take away, and although I have said it before to the county council, say it again to appropriate people.
Can I just come in there and say that I go to the tip with a bike and add the trailer on the back, and it's great because I can go past all the cars. I don't have to wait. Probably should, but I just go straight past them all, and it's brilliant. And it's the fastest way to get things to the tip. And I've got various Sainsbury's crates that I've sort of found over the years, and pile them all back, and I can take equivalent of probably what would be in the back of a Ford Focus on the bike. So yeah, that's a trick if you want to bypass on a bank holiday to get to the tip.
Even if you have a bike, you have to book in Hampshire, so it's worth talking about the situation we've got.
Yes, it is something that we have taken up before. I'm conscious of time and we're coming to the close, so I'm afraid we're not going to get through all the questions we've been asked. One question which has been raised by several people is around the electrification of vehicles, particularly cars. I have Councillor Mike Reid who has a related question, but we have been asked, you know, what difference will electrifying cars make, and is that part of the answer? Mike, I'm going to unmute you now and you can ask your question as well.
Thank you, Kelsie. Thank you for all the speakers. It's been quite interesting, quite involving in a sense. Electric vehicles are much heavier on the road, as has already been stated. They are larger than the conventional vehicles, the fossil fuel ones. However, because of their weight, they are actually causing damage to the road surface. People moan about potholes, and one of the reasons we've got so many potholes is because of electrification with regard to vehicles. This was told to me by the Department of Transport and also the police. How can we get, and again, I don't suppose there's anybody here who can answer it, how can we get Hampshire County Council to review its road structuring? In my road, I have at least 2 foot where every time the road surface has been adjusted, they've thrown it further. There's no foundations to the road collapses, generally towards the residents. Can I give the other question as well? Kelsie?
Can we deal with electric vehicles, I think?
Okay.
Mike, do you want to put the other question in the chat and we'll...
I have.
Right, okay. Yeah, so clearly there is an issue with electric vehicles and weight, although I have to say this does seem to be driven to a great extent by people's choices in road vehicles, because petrol vehicles are getting much heavier and bigger and wider as well. There's no reason why an electric vehicle should fundamentally be heavier than a petrol one. I know several of you made comments about electric vehicles and that not being entirely the answer. So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to say something. I think that, you know, you hit the nail on the head, I think, in terms of vehicle size. You look at a Mini today and a Mini 30 years ago, and they are completely different sized vehicles. So it's a choice, and therefore we have to influence the market if we're going to reduce the size of vehicles. The second point I would say is that if we can move more people onto public transport, then overall there should be less cars on the road that would balance out the heavier vehicles that are electric for when people do need to use their car. That's how I would like to see it, but you know, that probably needs a lot more intervention and carrots and sticks, I would have thought.
Yeah, thank you. Stewart.
Yeah, well, I think as I said in my presentation, I think there's a recognition that it's not just about electrification of vehicles and the bus fleet, etc. We do need to reduce traffic levels, and yeah, I think not much else to say. I think.
Right, Phil, did you want to come in at the end of that?
Yeah, I think the equivalent electric vehicle is a bit heavier, but I think small vehicles are lighter than big vehicles, whether they're electric or diesel. So I completely support the suggestion that we need to encourage people to get smaller vehicles and use them less. Then our road surface, and anyway, there's a pothole fund which we've lost HS2 to pay for. So we should be able to get through this, but there are different solutions, I think.
No, I think you're right, and I think that a lot of the presentations, well, all the presentations, I think have talked about that need to think other than the car, rather than just alternative forms of fuel. Now, I am sorry that we haven't reached, we haven't managed to ask all the questions. I will have a look through the questions we've got and see about writing at least a short written response to those whose questions I haven't answered today. We are running slightly over, but I would just like to finish today with a small Slido, as we like to traditionally finish with, asking about the what you think the barriers are to using public transport or active travel. Anna, I'll hand over to you to explain how this works.
Hopefully you can see my screen, and if you scan the QR code with your phone, it should take you straight to the poll, or you can go to the website slido.com and put in the code you can see on screen, and hopefully that will also give you an opportunity to participate.
Yeah, so we'd just like people to join that Slido poll and just write down their major issues with public transport or active travel, which we can take away and think about. I will take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers this evening. I think it's been really informative. I'd certainly appreciated it if you could all forward your presentations to us, and then we can get that up on the website for people to refer to in future. A lot of it is things that people have been asking us a lot of questions about over the past year or so, and it's good to see that being presented in a way that's quite digestible and helps people understand some of the backgrounds and some of the difficulties with moving forward with this agenda. So looking at the Slido, we've got frequency coming out clearly around the buses, convenience, reliability with cycling, the lack of separate cycle paths. I'm sure you can all see these coming through. So we'll just give that another minute or so to go. Right. Yeah. Thank you to everybody who's made the effort to fill that in. Again, this will provide part of our record of the meeting. So we've still got a participant typing, so we'll wait for that to finish. Right, so like I say, thank you very much to our speakers, Marc, Roddy, Stewart and Phil. And we may well ask you back again on another occasion. So I'll just say a good night to everybody and thank you very much for attending.